Ornament and decoration, geometry and pattern have always been these fascinating tools to define architectural spaces and design objects. They've been used for centuries as a way to convey something about cultural identity, references to history, and you see this across a variety of scales ranging from small-scale domestic objects, metalwork, textiles, furniture, all the way through to larger-scale examples of interiors and full-scale buildings. My name is Abraham Thomas, and I'm the Daniel Brodsky Curator for Architecture, Design and Decorative Arts at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And I'm going to be talking to you today about architecture and ornament, design, decoration and pattern, and how these tools have been used across a variety of contexts and scales within design and architectural history. The first object I'd like to talk to you about are these fascinating candlesticks by William Watkins. These date from the late 18th century. And what I find fascinating about these objects are the way in which they, first of all, convey a reference to history, because what we're looking at are these silver candlesticks with these sort of fluted column elements and these capitals, clearly with a distinctive architectural reference, very much reflecting the period in which there had been these recent excavations at sites like Pompeii, for example. This is the moment of the Grand Tour. And these are objects which I find very interesting because they, first of all, they're of a domestic scale, they're candlesticks, but they convey this very architectural, monumental presence with this kind of very literal depiction of columns. So they're sort of speaking to this neoclassical language, which was very common at that time in the late 18th century. But what I find also particularly curious and fascinating about these objects is that, when we look at these objects from today's perspective, from 300 years hence, we can almost see these as very postmodernist objects. They sort of give a clue to what happens much later in the sort of 20th century, for example, where we see a re-embracing of ornament. And one of the reasons I find ornament and decoration so interesting is that it's always been this kind of battleground when you look at architectural and design history. We had moments of, for example, here with the late 18th century with neoclassicism, this kind of approach to an austerity and a kind of sense of order and formalism. But then later in the 19th century, associated with moments like the design reform movement, especially in England, for example, the work of Owen Jones and the grammar of ornament, for example, we see this kind of re-embracing of a kind of eclecticism that's very associated with design and decoration of the Victorian period. So, for example, these are a couple of pages from Owen Jones's Grammar of Ornament, published in the mid-19th century, and can be considered very much a sort of design source book. You can see here how Jones publishes this design source book, drawing upon a number of disparate sources ranging from textiles to architectural sources, and bringing together these objects through this rationalized grid to sort of compare and contrast. And what I find very interesting about this period is that it's sort of conveying this idea of defining a new design style for that period of the 19th century through this kind of eclecticism. So, for example, this page is taken from Jones's studies of the Alhambra, for example, and trying to look at kind of notions of color theory and balance within that building, particularly here with the tile work, for example, that he's sort of extracted and sort of distilled down on the page in this rather rationalist way. And of course, it's important to note that projects like the Grammar of Ornament also conveyed a sort of colonial imperial attitude to kind of taking these sources, these very specific cultural sources, out of context and sort of almost universalizing and creating a kind of sense of perhaps what we might think of now as a sort of false equivalence across cultural contexts and histories. But what Jones was trying to achieve was to try and find something that was considered a sort of new direction for design that might be perhaps divorced from that moment we saw earlier on with this kind of very austere kind of classicism that you see with Watkins' candlesticks, for example. The other thing that I find very powerful about the Grammar of Ornament is that, by the sheer nature of these dense arrangements of patterns and color and form, in my reading of it, there's this sense of kind of remixing and kind of resampling these examples of ornament and decoration. And this is something that you see very much happening later on in the 20th century, when after the legacies of early 20th century modernism and the kind of legacy of the Bauhaus, where in many cases there was almost a rejection of overly decorative ornamentation and color, and rather hewing towards a sort of more formalist kind of design direction. What you see happening later in the 20th century with postmodernism is a kind of re-embracing of color and decoration, and a sort of reinsertion of wit and irony within design. And this is just one example of how examples of ornament and decoration being this kind of ideological debate about whether ornament and decoration has its place to play within architecture and design. One of the periods of early 20th century design that I find very interesting is when, in this kind of wake of 19th century design and the moment of the grammar of ornament and Owen Jones and this kind of theorizing of decoration and ornament, we see in the early 20th century examples in Europe of a very restrained form of design and decoration, particularly from designers in Austria and Vienna and the secession movement and the Wiener Werkstätte, very much hand in hand with the theories of Adolf Loos and his seminal text, Ornament and Crime, which essentially was a sort of rejection of ornament, seeing as ornament as sort of superfluous, perhaps decadent. And so what we see in the early 20th century, again, is a sort of example of this ideological nature of ornament and decoration. We see examples from the Wiener Werkstätte, designers like Joseph Hoffmann, and these are both great examples from the NGV collection. You can see a sort of restrained elegance where there are these hints towards, for example, that fluting that we saw on the column shafts of those candlesticks by William Watkins. But here you can see a much more pared down palette and a sort of rationalized form of geometry with these forms. But here, for example, in the chair by Joseph Hoffmann, we can see here a very similar fluting to what we saw earlier with the William Watkins candlesticks, and even a sort of area of kind of very detailed, subtle beading here at the upper level of these chair legs. Despite this very rationalized approach to design, there's still this kind of idea of the language of ornament and pattern coming through, even within an object like this. And you can see how with the upholstery, there's a wonderful echo of the fluting of the legs, these kind of architectural column type legs extending through the kind of pattern on this upholstery. So what we see happening later in the 20th century, in that sort of post-war period, long after the legacies of early 20th century modernism, we start to see a re-embracing of colour, pattern, decoration, particularly with designers and architects associated with the postmodernist design movement. One of my favourite examples within the NGV collection of this approach to postmodern design in the late 20th century is this wonderful, exquisite tea set by Michael Graves, one of the leading proponents of the postmodern movement, known for many of his buildings of the period, for example, the Portland Art Museum, perhaps most famously. What I love about this object is it kind of makes one think of those earlier candlesticks that we looked at by William Watkins. There's this sort of homage to that kind of language of neoclassicism, but it's sort of infused with this kind of irreverence and humor and wit, where we still see examples of the kind of fluting taken from that kind of neoclassical period, this kind of homage to the ancient world. But here we're seeing it kind of filtered through this lens of a kind of cartoonish exaggeration almost. So you see these rather bulky proportions. It's completely ignoring the strict orders of architecture which so defined classical architecture and then the neoclassical period later in the 18th and 19th century. Here instead, Graves is entirely just having fun with this kind of language of classicism, with these rather chunky legs, the sort of wide proportions of the fluting, the kind of exaggerated, scaled up forms of the handle and the other kind of decorative elements. And it's very much in a way kind of distilling this pop art sensibility. One can think of these sort of moments of postmodern design very much kind of taking influence from that kind of pop art moment of kind of scaling up imagery, thinking about color and decoration. So there's this kind of language of sort of zestiness and fun and pure joy and playfulness within these objects. Another great example by Michael Graves is this object from the mid-1980s. Here you see the now iconic teapot for Alessi by Michael Graves. On the one hand, the form is such a beautiful, restrained, geometrical form, almost indicative of that, going back to that early 20th century moment of Wiener Werkstätte, for example, even kind of late 19th century arts and crafts, Christopher Dresser. But what I love that Graves is doing here is finding these sort of very subtle moments of ornament and pattern to kind of introduce into this restrained form. So for example, most obviously you have these wonderful pops of color with the blue handle, the introduction of plastic here within the metal object, and then the beautiful rendering of the kind of whistling bird. And then, perhaps more subtly, we see here these kind of references to riveting, which you see on the lower circumference edge of the teapot, a kind of reference to sort of industrial objects, aeroplane design from the early 20th century, for example. So it's sort of conveying this idea of this being a purely industrial object, but being something that is harking back to a golden age of industrial design. So this moment in the 1980s, this re-embracing of colour, joy, pattern, a kind of pop sensibility, is something very much associated with the Memphis group, a design collective including designers such as Ettore Sottsass, who produced this wonderful room divider, also from the NGV collection. This is a great example of Memphis's strategy to kind of embrace colour, decoration. You could almost see this room divider as being partly sculptural, with the kind of almost like a semblance of a figure here in the upper part of the room divider, but the rest of it can really be seen as almost like an abstract painting, these rigid forms and kind of balances of solids and voids within the form. It's almost like these are objects that are cartoon scales of ornament and decoration, and seen as very much visual statements within these new domestic environments of the period. What's also interesting to note at this time period is the kind of approach to colour and decoration, pattern, ornament, across a variety of scales. So very much like Owen Jones within the ground of ornament, there was this context of applying these design ideas, these design theories to a variety of contexts, whether it was sort of furniture, textiles, or full-scale buildings. One of my favourite buildings in the world is the Pompidou, and not necessarily the more famous facade that faces that plaza. This was a building designed by Richard Rogers and Renzo Piano, opened in 1977. I particularly love the reverse of this building, where you see this, again, it's almost like thinking about this like a series of pages from the Grammar of Ornaments. You can see here the sort of colour coding of certain functional elements of the building, whether it's air conditioning, ducting, or water supply. Every function is expressed through different colours, as a sort of, almost like a kind of diagram or like a circuit diagram. And so it's a very different context to using colour, but again, it's willingness to kind of embrace these bright colours and these are very vivid hues. And then there are other examples from slightly later, perhaps like 10 years or so after the Pompidou project with, for example, this wonderful building, again, kind of in a way there's this kind of reference to an industrial language. This is a pumping station in East London by John Outram, a building that was kind of colloquially called the Temple of the Storms, a very kind of everyday kind of functional building, but you can see here how the kind of visual expression is sort of conveyed through this postmodern approach to colour, decoration, scale. So on the one hand, you see these historicizing elements, rather like the William Watkins candlesticks, which were referring to Greek and Roman classicism with those fluted columns. Here instead, Outram is referring to Egyptian papyrus capitals, for example, but the kind of capitals have been rendered with this very oversized, overscale form and kind of almost cartoonish scales of colour application. The kind of polychromy brick banding references to everything from like high Victorian Gothic church architecture to sort of Mamluk architecture of medieval Cairo. And on the top you have these kind of corrugated steel elements for the roof elements, and here in the middle this kind of reference to like a jet aircraft engine, for example. Again, that kind of reference to an industrial language, but at a scale which seems totally out of proportion with how you would kind of think about this facade of this building. And it's kind of such a curious building, and you'd never imagine this was like a pumping station. And similarly, we see a building by James Stirling from the very early 1990s. And this is number 1 Poultry in the centre of London in the Square Mile. And here I love this building for the way in which it references historical polychromy. Again, there's this, like the John Outram Temple of the Storms, you see this polychromy banding of the sort of sandstone, the kind of alternating deep red and cream coloured stone, the dominant kind of clock element in the middle, the kind of cornices which reference Egyptian architecture, and the whole thing looks like the prow of an ocean liner. So there's all these kind of historical references and a kind of real re-embracing of kind of bold colour and decoration. So it just goes to show that these ideas around ornament and decoration that kind of have traveled through time could be applied to kind of the scale of architecture as well as design objects, and they really define that period of time in which they were created. I hope this has been an interesting insight into kind of the role of ornament and decoration across architecture, design, across a variety of scales. I hope that these examples have shown that there's a sort of almost like a political dimension to the use of colour and decoration. It's not necessarily a neutral choice. These are sort of very intentional design choices, often provocative, often subversive. It's fascinating seeing these tools and these devices coming kind of in and out of favour across these various design contexts. And it's something that I think when I look at design objects and buildings, it's a way of thinking about these ideas being encoded in those artifacts.